I had a Mandela effect moment this week.
Okay.
It could have been quite damaging to my professional integrity.
Is this a Mandela effect or the fact that you're in your 40s and getting forgetful?
No, I think it's not that. It's that the universe has changed around me. It's not that I'm getting old and don't get enough sleep.
Yeah, and you also have famously never been wrong about anything, so...
Exactly. My professional integrity depends on it. Yeah, I was chatting to a journalist, right, in France about the quote-unquote hot new trend for tattoo removal. And I was like, yeah, like someone died from getting laser. And he was like, oh, really? I've not heard that. Send me information. And then I went to look for the information and it turned out, no, that didn't happen. Like, I swear, I have a very, very serious flashbulb memory of someone getting tattooed for too long, getting laser tattoo removal for too long, and then them dying from that. But it didn't happen.
So essentially,
all the ingredients of it did. So there are people that have died from being lasered, but for hair removal. There are people that have had severe systemic reactions, but like no one's died from getting laser tattoo removal yet, as far as we know. And I nearly said it to Le Monde.
Ooh, so you would have been responsible for spreading scientific misinformation and giving people bad information of what products contain.
Exactly. So I think we should use our platform for good and fix the universe. Correct.
That's why you're refusing to continue the Ink Master series. But with that in mind, you're very welcome to Beneath the Skins, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. And with that Mandela effect / Matt getting old out of the way, we have a really interesting episode, something that I think the two of us have been interested in for quite a long time. It just so happened that someone, like when you are very publicly talk about tattoos for a living, whenever there is anything tattoo related, 100 people sent it to you. And the subject of today's episode was sent to me probably by about 50 different people. It's like, have you seen this? So today we're going to be talking about tattooing. It's a very kind of interesting subject, one that we've talked about in the past. Matt, you did an episode on your own talking about the ban of certain pigments in the EU. But we are joined by Dr. John Swierk, to talk about his research into what is and isn't in tattooing. John, you're very welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
So I suppose for a bit of background, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a chemistry professor at Binghamton University in New York, the United States. And one of the things that my research group works on is tattoos, right? Specifically the question of why does light cause a tattoo to fade? But as part of that work, we sort of stumbled into just looking at what's actually in commercial tattooings.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose a beginning question is, where did your interest come from in terms of studying tattooings? And also, what kind of existing research and literature is out there around what's in tattooings?
So my group generally, right, thinks a lot about how light can be used to drive chemistry, study chemistry, things like that. And that got us into asking this question about how light transforms tattoos in the body. And so as we were starting to work on this question, we were buying tattoo inks, and the grad students kept coming back and saying, I'm seeing some weird stuff in here, right? It doesn't seem like it should be here, right? And at first we thought, maybe we were breaking the tattoo ink down into something weird, and then, you'd go and you'd do the control experiment and it was already in the bottle straight from the manufacturer.
God bless your gentle, naive souls.
So, we started thinking maybe we need to figure out what's in this stuff, right? What's in the ink. And certainly we're not the first people to look at tattoo inks. There have been a fair number of studies looking at the pigments in tattoo inks. And if you're familiar with that research, that keeps flagging over and over again that there are often problems with wrong pigments being used or unlisted pigments, things like that. So we were interested in could we sort of apply that work to stuff that was being sold on the US market, but go farther than just looking at the pigments, right? And also look at the carrier package because that was sort of very underexplored. And so that work recently came out after undergoing peer review. And I think it was a little bit surprising to us and maybe to some others what we found.
Well, it's been a really hot topic of discussion. I mean, I was at a conference in Germany last year, and everyone there was talking about the REACH laws that were coming in, and I know a guy who works for one of the big European who supply pigment manufacturers, and they've been frantically trying to kind of formulate things. And I know people that are grad students in Germany working on various research groups, and although those EU rules were kind of telegraphed a long time ago, they obviously came into effect early last year, and I think still caught people unawares. And there's been lots of kind of debate within the industry, and of course, like politically, about the applicability of those laws. And I think what one of the things that my German friend said to me was how little work had been done in the US, because a lot of the supply was coming. A lot of the kind of credible supply, at least, was coming from US suppliers. And then all of a sudden, when European distributors had to kind of certify their inks to be suitable for use in the European Union, they found that the American market was like way behind even where the Europeans were on this. Like, what's been your experience in kind of comparing the research and actually the kind of practical stuff in the American market compared to the EU one? Because I think your paper like pulls out some really, really interesting, well, we'll get into them, quite surprising findings based largely on US manufacturers, right?
It's absolutely night and day, right? The amount of work around the science of tattooing that has been done is definitely inadequate. But what has been done overwhelmingly has been done in Europe, both looking at just sort of how tattoos stay in the skin, how they transform, work on pigments. The majority of that work has come out of European labs. There is certainly some work from groups in America, but it is much sparser. And that's, a big issue, right? Because as you correctly pointed out, a lot of these inks are made in the US. They're being shipped overseas. The regulations in the US are significantly less developed than in the EU. Up until less than 2 years ago, there really weren't regulations on tattoo inks in the US, right? And now there's kind of this scramble to catch up. And I think one of the things that's a little bit unfortunate is that with EU REACH and with MOCRA in the US and regulations of that like in other places, all of a sudden there's this screaming need for research around tattoos. There's all these questions around safety substantiation. There's questions around good manufacturing practices, and the lack of data is a huge problem. Yeah. And it's not one that's easily fixed.
Yeah, and you mentioned MOCRA. So if people who are listening don't know, MOCRA is this Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, so this sort of US law, and it has parallels to the European regulation, right, which was trying to make sense of any chemical substance that you put on or in prolonged contact with your skin. So in Europe, it applied to things like makeups and topical creams and hair dyes. And my understanding of the US rule is that's the same. And one of the criticisms that a lot of Europeans that I spoke to had was actually that the chemistry of how pigments react on the skin is very different to how pigments react in the skin. And so things were being allowed for tattooing because they were safe to put on the skin and actually were dangerous, and vice versa. Things were being prohibited from tattooing because they were dangerous in hair dye, but seem to not have any negative effects in tattooing. So, I mean, what's the situation in the US? Is it the same kind of goal to rationalize cosmetic pigmentation with tattoo pigmentation? And what's the chemistry there, and what's the research there?
So, in terms of comparing MOCRA to the EU REACH regulations, MOCRA does not go as far as REACH, at least at this point. There aren't things being banned from use in tattoo inks. Right now, the focus of MOCRA is manufacturing, accurate labeling, reporting of adverse events, some safety substantiation, things like that. And, even that's not really into place yet because you're going from essentially no regulation, no oversight whatsoever to now this framework has been imposed by the United States Congress, and the FDA is trying to figure out how this is going to work. And at the same time, too, there's all of this stuff dealing with the traditional cosmetics industry that they have to figure out as well. So MOCRA is still a very open question in terms of how it's going to affect the U.S. tattoo industry, and that's still being sorted out.
I was just going to ask, I think maybe to just take a quick step back before we go forward for anyone who's kind of unfamiliar of like how tattoo inks work. I'm sure we've talked about it on the show before, but essentially it's like a neutral carrier liquid and the pigment is added into it, and then that's how the pigment is placed into the skin. Am I correct?
Yeah. And the assumption is that, right, the pigment doesn't dissolve into the carrier package, right? You think about salt dissolving into water, the pigment is more like sand in water, right? It's not going to dissolve. And so the assumption is that when the ink is inserted into the skin, that the carrier package will drain away over a relatively short period of time, leaving the pigment behind. We don't know if that's true, but that's the assumption.
Yeah, for anyone who's listened to this show for a long time, the equivalent of the SATs in Ireland is called the Leaving Cert. I did the lowest level of chemistry that was possible. It was very far beyond me, so I'm going to be very impressed with your knowledge today. But so obviously, part of the big issue in terms of what your work attempts to address is the fact that we don't necessarily know how these carrier solutions interact within the body. And the problem of mislabeling is that you don't necessarily know what the constituent ingredients are in it, so therefore the outcomes are unpredictable. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole range of issues, right? So, of course, there's a safety issue. Some of the things in there have known safety concerns. Some of it is an ethical thing, right? That if you're going to get a tattoo, you have a right, I think, to know what you're putting into your skin and your body and to be able to make an informed choice. There are some things that we find in the carrier package that are not necessarily toxic, but can have a significant allergic response in some people. And I think those folks should be able to say to their artist, please don't use that ink on me. And every artist I've met would like to be able to say to their clients, this is what's in the ink. Do you have any problems? Are you okay with using this?
Yeah, and for thousands of years, like tattooing was basically carbon black, and occasionally terrifyingly cinnabar, like mercury salts for red. And then in the Victorian era, we got kind of an array of colors, and tattooers were kind of experimenting with various different commercially available paints, basically, to make things that work. What are we talking about in terms of the constituents of modern commercial tattoo inks that you found on the market?
So one of the things that I think is important to distinguish, right, because a lot of the work around safety of tattooing comes into this question of, well, we've been tattooing for millennia. Why is this an open question? And I think, and you would know even better than I would, right, that it's important to make this distinction that commercial tattooing is a relatively modern invention. You don't need to go that far back, right, to find artists buying pigment, mixing it up, and making their own inks, right? And of course,
so colored inks really only started being used in the 1890s, and there are accounts of guys, for example, like trying to create a yellow, which one presume must have been cadmium lead, like trying to tattoo themselves with it, and it not working and getting toxic. And then through experimentation, through the right up until the 1990s, actually, certainly the 80s, there was a lot of kind of skullduggery and secrecy and people mixing their own inks. So yeah, commercially available mass-produced ink is really only about 30 years old. And the kind of huge scale mass production importation of tattoo inks is probably even less than 20 years old, I would say.
Absolutely. So that's part of the thing that we kind of try to emphasize, that what's going into a commercial mass-produced ink may not be the same as what an artist working in their own studio would mix up. So case in point, right, there is some credible whispers that, and we're starting to see, unpublished yet, data that corroborates this, that some ink manufacturers are using pre-made dispersions of pigments, right? And so what that means is, instead of using a solid powder, grinding it up and getting it to stay sort of suspended in the carrier package, they're buying a dispersion from another company. These dispersions are not made for tattooing, right? And in general, there is no pigment manufacturer making pigments for tattooing. They're making it for printing inks, for plastics, other things like that. And these dispersions contain a lot of proprietary components, right? So it's not clear what's necessarily in those. So the modern manufacturer is often buying a dispersion and then adding to it things like some alcohols, glycerin, maybe to adjust the viscosity, and then whatever sort of witch's brew each individual manufacturer has that they think gives them the best ink performance.
And I would assume then that dispersion they're essentially kind of like diluting it down to make it safe for internal human use.
I don't think I would agree with the latter part of that. They're certainly diluting it down for use in tattooings, but right, as I'm aware, there's no research, and nobody I've spoken to in that industry has sort of done studies about, this is the safe level of pigment and things like that.
I think this is the work that's being done one of the things that's been done in Germany at the moment is, the assumption in REACH was that things would be, there was a kind of class of toxicity and things that were in that group would automatically be prohibited. But it turns out that some of the things that were on the safe group was either because there was no data, and so some of these new inks which were REACH approved are actually more dangerous, or turning out to be more dangerous than the things that have been banned. Or conversely, that things that were definitely not suitable for hair dye for sitting on the skin turned out to be actually better than the REACH approved things in the skin. So this is a real Wild West, as you said, and as you said, it's quite surprising here. I mean, what's been the reaction to I mean, I know this paper's only just come out, but when you talk to kind of non-tattoo people, to chemists about this, I mean, even in your lab, like how surprising and shocking was all this when you started doing this work? I mean, and what do chemists make of this? Because I know you're not a biologist, you're not really an expert in toxicity of the human body, but you are an expert in the chemistry of this. So what are chemists making of it all?
So overwhelmingly, right, when I talk to colleagues across disciplines about tattoos, the number one thing that surprises people is just how little we actually understand tattoos, right? I think there's this assumption that based on the prevalence of tattoos, that it's something we really understand well. And that is absolutely not true, right? It's hard for me to think of another thing that is so commonplace, so widespread, and so economically important that is so poorly understood. The second thing that always surprises people is how little regulation and sort of good manufacturing practices there are around inks. I think there's an assumption both in the scientific community and just from people that are not that heavily involved in the tattoo industry that tattoo inks are, highly regulated, carefully produced, the sort of assumptions that you make around food, right? People assume that, food has high purity and that it's, everything is listed. And they're always surprised when I tell them that's not the case with tattoo inks. And then I think the third thing that always surprises chemists is when I show them the structures of the pigments that get used in tattooing. And, to be honest, right, and I don't want to make any claims around safety, because I think that's a complicated discussion that I'm happy to get into. But I would say that the most honest answer there is that the question of what is safe hasn't really been defined appropriately, and that the research is still out. But putting that aside for the moment, right? If I bought the molecules that are used as pigments in tattoos, and we were using them in my lab, right, without gloves and lab coats and safety goggles and appropriate protective equipment, right, we would get temporarily shut down for serious safety violations for handling potentially hazardous materials. And so, you look at the structures of pigments, and in particular, some of the pigments that you alluded to that have come on the market as safe alternatives for EU REACH absolutely terrify me, right? I have no idea.
What kind of things are you talking about specifically, and what kind of things are surprising your colleagues? Like what compounds, what particular kind of mixtures was particularly surprising to you to find?
So pigment blue 60 in particular is absolutely terrifying to me, right? I can't believe that would go into the skin. Just from a structural standpoint, right? Pigment blue 61, they look like molecules that you can imagine breaking down into really nasty things, right? So pigment blue 60, 61. To be honest with you, most of the red and yellows and some of the oranges certainly contain sort of molecular structures, right? That you look at as a chemist and you think, boy, that looks kind of weak, for lack of a better word. And if that breaks, right, that molecule breaks apart, you would be worried about some of the things that are released, right? So, for example, pigment yellow 74, there's a linkage there called an azo linkage, which is two nitrogen atoms connected together. But if that breaks, the thing that it would probably break into is known to be, at least toxic to aquatic life. And, as a chemist, you start to get a sense of like, oh, that looks like something you don't want to put in your DNA or cells, right? And you see a lot of that over and over again in tattooing. Does that mean that those pigments are hazardous? Not necessarily, right? Because we don't understand how they break down, and that's one of the questions that we're after. But it's enough to make you go, ooh, boy, we should really figure out the answer to this.
Yeah, and I mean, you can look back at even in the kind of mid-century or kind of latter half of the 20th century, where tattooers are talking about their recipes, and they are just buying like industrial pigments from Dow Chemical, from the big paint manufacturers, stuff that stuff that otherwise would be sprayed on car paint, stuff that would be used in all kinds of industrial applications, let alone anything else.
Yeah, classic. The classic example is Sailor Jerry developing purple. And no one knew how he was developing that purple. And Matt, what was it revealed to be?
I can't remember the top of my head, but it was something that he bought from Sun Chemical, in New York.
It was pharmaceutical dyes for tablets for medication that he was then mixing into a tattoo ink.
Yeah, and I think in talking about things breaking down, maybe that's also you talked about tattooing. The other thing we don't understand is how it fades, right? And obviously people who are tattooed know for a long time that being in the sun is something that fades, and of course some fading is to do with the biology of your skin. But you've become interested, John. You said in some of the some of the chemistry of pigment breakdown in light, and as we get into thinking about laser, remember we'll come on to that in a second as well. Actually, what happens to these pigments, even if they're okay in a macrophage in the skin, when they're exposed and broken down by high pulse lasers, that's also a problem. So can you talk us through what's happening when light's interacting with these pigments as well, and why that concerns you?
So I can tell you what we think is happening. The real answer is that at least with laser tattooing, and we really don't understand that well. The whole sort of field of laser tattoo removal is based on, an estimates of how much a graphite nanoparticle heats up in a laser, right? Same material that you use in your pencil. But graphite's not used in tattoo inks, and the whole structure of, a tattoo doesn't look anything like that. So there's an assumption that at least with laser tattooing, what happens is that the laser interacts with the pigment, causes rapid heating, that then causes some molecular breakdown and usually the formation of gas, and that causes a fragmentation of the pigments. And that as the pigments fragment, they form smaller chunks that the body is able to move out of the skin and move away, right? There's an assumption right now that the pigment that gets inserted into the skin is too large for the white blood cells to fully sort of engulf and pull out of the skin, so it just sort of sticks there. Although, again, right, coming back to that question, even that picture is still a little bit hazy, right? Because when you actually ask the question, well, how does the ink stay in the skin? People, the answer we come up with is, well, the white blood cells sort of surround it, but it's too big to kind of engulf it. But that doesn't actually explain the answer to that question, right? So we still don't really understand how it's there. And, anybody with tattoos, right, knows that, a nice, sharp, sort of pencil thin line over time has a pretty high tendency to blur a little bit, blue out. So pigment, we can see that pigment is moving, right? And in people with a lot of tattoos, we know that you can get pigments in the lymph nodes. So there is some movement there through a process that's just not understood. And then when you add in the potential for high temperature, high pressure chemistry, weird stuff can happen, right? And, we're not dealing with pigments that are basically like crushed rock that are going to be pretty robust. We're dealing with molecules that are mostly carbon and hydrogen with some other elements sort of sprinkled in. Those are not things that are going to withstand temperatures of 1,000 degrees and high pressures, right? They're going to break down into we don't know what, if that mechanism is correct. And that mechanism may not be correct. So that's what kind of got us into this area.
I mean, do we know how? I mean, what's the general science of how pigment fades outside the body? Like, why do things fade chemically anyway?
So usually, what would happen, right, is that and I'm gonna try to approach this in the least technical way I can explain, right? But when something absorbs light, right, what's happening is that the energy in light is being converted into energy in that molecule, and so an electron on that molecule gets moved around, and most of the time that excess energy that's been dumped into the molecule gets relaxed out because the molecule vibrates and loses it as heat, or maybe it re-emits it. So if you've ever seen something that's glowy, that's because it's absorbing light and re-emitting it. But every so often, while it's in that sort of what we would call excited state, before it's done something with that energy, there is a probability, can be very low probability, but there is a probability that it could react with something like oxygen from the air. Alternatively, something like ultraviolet light has a lot of energy, and that can excite a molecule in a way that causes that molecule to fragment, right? So, or sometimes oxygen by itself, right, can just over time, even with a low probability of reacting, can just slowly oxidize molecules, transform them. And so what that usually means is that you're not necessarily breaking down the whole molecule. You're just sort of, in kind of simplified terms, smashing out some linkages between atoms, and it causes the colors of light that get absorbed to shift to higher energies. So you no longer see it anymore, but it's still there.
Yeah. And I mean, even from my schoolboy chemistry and my understanding in the conventional way of how tattoos work, I can see why some of that explanation doesn't fully explain what's happening with tattoos then.
Exactly, right. And because the actual picture of the tattoo in the skin is still a little bit unsettled, right? It's hard to map a specific mechanism onto things. And then, once you understand the mechanism, right, you could start to think about how do you make better pigments, right? One of the things that I also think surprises folks a lot is that, to my knowledge, nobody's ever made like a bespoke tattoo pigment, right? Nobody's ever said, well, gosh, what should a tattoo pigment look like, right? It's just using stuff that's used in
not from chemistry upwards, right? I think people start with effect and then work backwards, and if people come out in terrible hives or allergic reactions, then don't use it next time. So I think it's always come from that way around, rather than, as you said, people starting from the chemistry. And I think one of the theories that I've heard manufacturers, or people that I know that work in the tattoo industry talk about, again with no expertise other than just spitballing, is that this desire to create brighter colors, to create more durable pigments, to create more kind of gradation of a palette available to a tattooer, to kind of also fine tune some of that other stuff that you want from a tattoo ink that you mentioned, like viscosity and ease of getting in the skin in the first place. Like it's this kind of almost market driven desire to produce better effects for the consumer and the tattooer has led to some of these less cautious developments and putting in things that have beneficial quote unquote effects for the aesthetic or the practical side of things, without much concern for the for the biochemistry or the chemistry of the whole thing, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of a shame, right? Because it's understandable, but the engagement between the scientific community and the tattooing community for a long time has been almost nil. And even
it's been informal, right?
Yeah.
So Sailor Jerry, who Tom mentioned, one of the people involved in him helping develop purple tattooing was a PhD chemist, right? But he was just a guy who tattooed. So it was like, it's all very kind of cowboy, very kind of MacGyver, certainly.
Yeah. And when we first started working on tattoos, which was fall 2019, we encountered a very mixed reaction, right? There would be some folks in the tattooing world that were really excited and thought it was great, and then we would encounter some real hostility. And that only changed, at least in the US, with the passage of MOCRA. It's been kind of a wild shift, right? Because overnight it went from a lot of folks saying, we don't want you mucking about in here, to what can you tell us? We need answers right now. What can we do
need you? Yeah, exactly.
It's dizzying. And one of the things that I find totally baffling is that certainly every ink manufacturer that I'm aware of, and there may be some that do have somebody on staff, but virtually none of them have chemists on staff. And the ones that I am aware of, they've had bachelor's level chemists, but not necessarily a PhD level chemist, right? And that's not to knock their expertise, but it's a very different sort of level of skill set and training. And so that leads to, I think, issues with understanding, the stuff you're getting in and putting it into the ink, right? Because you don't have anybody on staff that can look at this and say, well, wait a minute, this data isn't right. And then when you think about pigments, right, there is a huge wealth of knowledge in terms of making pigments and dyes in the scientific community, right? This is, the designing of pigments and dyes is considered to be kind of an uninteresting, largely solved problem in our world, which means that there is a enormous palette of things that is available to these manufacturers that may not be in use for manufacturing spray paint or plastics or printer ink, but could be ideal for tattoos. But because there's just not a lot of crosstalk or historically a lot of interest from manufacturers, the set of pigments that are used is pretty small, right? Yeah. It's shockingly small, honestly.
So, John, what you're saying is, if you ever want to make a career pivot, you've correctly identified a gap in the market.
Well, maybe, but the thing is, you have to have interest, right? And
yeah, right. Maybe not, right? This is the point. Yeah. Maybe you haven't.
Right. I mean, I've had these conversations with ink manufacturers before, right? I've made the point, like, there is, particularly in the context of REACH, where the primary blue and green pigments in tattooing were banned and at least theoretically no longer in use. Finding an alternative has become a significant challenge, and it's led to the use of some of these pigments that I don't think should be being used, to be blunt.
Well, I think that's as I said, I think that's what's coming out of those early German studies too. And I mean, I think it needs right. It needs people who are chemists. It needs people that are biochemists. It needs people that are epidemiologists. It needs people that are tattooers as well, right, to understand this from both sides. Maybe like on that manufacturing side, like the other thing that came up in your paper a lot is like labeling and standardization, where things. I mean, you point out in your paper that a lot of things aren't labeled, and then where they are labeled, there are things in it that aren't on the label. There are things on the label that aren't in it. Like the shocking thing for me reading your paper was how divergent the labeling and presumably that implies the manufacturing. I don't know what you think, whether that's deceptive or whether it's an illustration of manufacturing tolerances. But can you talk a bit about that? What you discovered when you were scanning these, or you were doing spectroscopy on these inks?
Yeah, right. So the big take home message was that we to give your listeners a quick summary, right? We focused on 9 ink brands that were accessible in the U.S. market. Right, we talked to a lot of tattooers to try to figure out what was a good ink, right? What was a bad ink? Tried to get a cross section of those. We only looked at ink that we could source directly from the manufacturer or through like an approved, third-party retailer. So there were some companies that we reached out to, said we'd like to get some ink. This is what we're doing, and they said, no, thank you. We won't sell you ink. And so we didn't include those, right? But as you know, counterfeit ink is a huge problem. And I just thought, ethically, the right way to do this is maximum transparency, right? And I wasn't going to put friends in the tattoo world in some kind of awkward position and asking them to sort of cloak and dagger provide us with, eternal ink or something like that. Within that, we started looking at a lot of inks, and it just quickly became kind of like overwhelming, right? Because there is seemingly an infinite number of tattoo inks in the world, and realized that we were going to have to make a trade-off between sort of quality and depth of our analysis or breadth, and decided that what we were going to do was look at 6 inks from each manufacturer, all the same color, right, and as closely matched in terms of color as we could find. And we felt that was a good representative snapshot, right? We're not a government lab. We're not a private testing lab. This is work done by graduate students that are trying to get their PhD and then move on to something else. So spending 7 years to meticulously study 300 tattooings just wasn't realistic for us.
But it's not at the root of it complicated methodology. You're like, as you said, the science of figuring out what constituent parts are of a pigment is not that complicated chemistry. It's quite straightforward. So yes, with those caveats you've pointed out, but the actual methodology you're using isn't that complex in a way.
No,
right?
It's definitely not rocket science. The challenge is just that it's it takes time, and there's a lot of data that has to be analyzed and looked at. And, to be honest too, right, with the passage of MOCRA, the question about labeling really became paramount. And we felt that, it was important to get it out there, right, and say what we were seeing. Because at least in the US, and honestly, even recently out of the EU, there really just wasn't work there that went to this. And so, one of the things we note in our paper is that just because we looked at, one brand of ink, a lot of these brands are owned by, corporations that make multiple inks, right? So, for example, we looked at ink from World Famous, but they're owned by the Body Art Alliance that has, World Famous, Kurosumi, and then several permanent makeup lines as well. So, if we found problems with one ink, it certainly suggested that maybe the manufacturing of all those inks across all those lines needed to at least be evaluated. So we eventually settled on a set of 54 inks that we looked at. We looked at the pigments. We looked at the carrier package, at least at a relatively high level of concentration. So on the order of about 2,000 parts per million. The reason for that is that we weren't comfortable publishing and identifying anything that we couldn't validate with at least two methods. I just thought that, these are commercial products. They are going into people's skin. This is also people's livelihoods. Anything that we were going to put in a paper had to be absolutely rock solid. We had to have 100% confidence. And so that meant if I couldn't get proof of it through multiple methods, we just put it aside, right? Because there's always a chance for, misinterpretation of something if you only have sort of one data point saying it's this, right? When you get to two, that makes it very unlikely that your assignment is incorrect. So, I think that's an important caveat to note, that we're looking at stuff on the order of about 2,000 ppm. And for context, the REACH regulations restrict some things down to the level of 2 ppm. So wow. I can't tell you that there's not more stuff in these inks than what we found. But with all of that out there, of the 54 inks we looked at, 6, we didn't find any discrepancies between what was in the bottle and what was on the label.
That's astonishing. 6 out of 54.
We found 3 inks where there were things listed on the bottle but that weren't in the ink, but we didn't find anything else in there. And then there were 45 inks that contained either unlisted pigments or unlisted additives. And we characterized those as major discrepancies.
Yeah, that makes very sobering and surprising reading that out of 54 inks you studied, only 6 their label correctly reported them, and 45 from 8 different manufacturers. So it's not just one rogue manufacturer had unlisted pigments or additives. Like, that's astonishing.
And it's important to note, right, that the problems ran the gamut from what I think are arguably top ink manufacturers in the world, right, from my discussions with tattooers, down to things on Amazon that you might buy if you're an apprentice trying to practice, right? So it wasn't just that bad inks were labeled poorly and quote-unquote good inks or premium inks were labeled well. It's a problem top to bottom across the board.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose to ask about those major discrepancies where stuff that wasn't listed was added in, what are we kind of seeing there in terms of additives, but also like different pigments being used?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So in terms of the pigments, right, you could see things like, listing a green pigment but actually using a blue and a yellow, or listing a blue and a yellow and using a green. Sometimes some incorrect like maybe it lists pigment red 254, but it's pigment red 120, something like that. Or in some cases, and it lists 3 pigments on the bottle and none of those pigments are in there, and instead it's a totally different set of things, right? So, that's surprising, but that didn't come as much out of the blue, because certainly other work has hinted at this being an issue. I think what surprised us is that, there were other studies that had flagged problems with pigments, even more than 10 years ago, and that it's still an issue. I think that was the surprising bit for me in that.
I was going to say, one of the things about that is that where you've got problematic labels on inks, if there are epidemiological, biochemical, or medical studies on tattoo inks, if those research teams aren't doing spectroscopy or chemical analysis on the pigment inks and then just trusting what's on the bottle, then any epidemiological medical work on the risks of tattooing for allergies or for long-term toxicity are going to be compromised too, right? Because presumably a lot of those research teams are just going to be looking at what's on the bottle and trusting that.
100%. And that's one of the arguments that we make, is that if you want to really understand this safety around tattoos, you have to start with knowing what's in a tattoo, right? Because if there's a whole bunch of
pigment as well,
if there's a whole bunch of unlisted stuff, whether it's pigment or carrier package additives in the tattoo, and nobody knows that, right? You're going to start running into issues where, one study is looking at tattoos that were made with adulterated inks, and they're seeing problems from something else potentially, and saying, well, no, we think it's this pigment. And then another study says, we don't see any problems with this pigment, right? And that doesn't advance the field or help anybody.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we don't know, and we shouldn't speculate too much. But I suspect that um, a lot of this is happening at the manufacturing plants rather than being deceptive labeling on the part of the distributors, and perhaps even the people selling this stuff don't exactly know what's in each bottle that they're sending out because they're trusting their supply chains.
It's from this, it's sort of impossible to know. As I mentioned before, right? It seems to be that a lot of ink manufacturers are buying pigments as dispersions, right? And that's got some kind of proprietary blend of stuff in there that may be contributing to some of this, right? There may be issues with sourcing ingredients, right? Contaminated materials. And it may also be intentional, right? So, for example, more than half of the inks we found polyethylene glycol in, right? And that's not a listed ingredient on any of these inks. But if you look at REACH compliant inks, it's a listed ingredient in a lot of those, right? So these manufacturers are certainly intentionally using polyethylene glycol in some of their inks, which could suggest, and I'm not saying it is, right? But I'm just saying it could suggest that it's an intentional add in these other inks. We just don't know. And it highlights the point that the change that needs to happen here has to happen at the manufacturing level, because the individual artist has absolutely no ability to really do this kind of analytical work, right? You can't, the sort of level of equipment and experience and time that's needed is just completely impractical for an individual artist.
As a consumer, as a wholesaler, whoever, whatever, you should be able to trust what's in the what's on the label, as you said, for all the reasons we've discussed. I mean, is this an issue? Again, maybe you're not the right person to ask this question to, but is this an issue across the food and drug and vitamin industry? I mean, I know a little bit about like wellness supplements and vitamins, like things that aren't super well regulated either, often have these discrepancies too. Like, presumably this isn't also just an issue with tattooing, right? Like, this problem of compliance and of labeling and of chemistry is not entirely a tattoo industry only problem. I mean, that's also sort of worrying and terrifying on its own.
No, certainly not. And I think even in industries that are nominally closely regulated, you still find issues, right? You still find issues with food, right? You can still find issues with pharmaceuticals. So it's not a unique issue, but it does appear to be an extremely pervasive issue in tattooing, right? Whereas I think when you look at food, right, it seems like when there are compliance issues, that tends to be more of an isolated incident. Whereas with tattooing, at least based on our snapshot, and when you couple that with work that other people had done in the past, it sort of seems like lack of compliance is more the norm than the exception. And that's
I think your work suggests that very clearly, actually. I think, and it is very sobering indeed.
So I don't know. We were talking about what we found. Do you want me to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Package. I don't.
Please do. Sorry, I interrupted. I interrupted you at the wrong stage. So tell us about the carrier package stuff, because I think that's also something that doesn't get talked about at all, really.
Yeah, right. Very little work on what's in the carrier packages, and I think part of that is that it's not easy to separate them from the pigments, and part of that is based on this assumption that the carrier package drains away, but again, we don't know how true or accurate that is. So where I think we were really surprised was what we were finding in the carrier package, right? So as I mentioned before, we found polyethylene glycol in more than half of the inks, right? And this is like
what is that? Yeah.
So it's a what we call long chain polymer, right? So it's lots of repeating molecular units over and over and over again, analogous to what a plastic would be, right?
Yeah.
And now polyethylene glycol, or PEG as it's usually shorthanded, it gets used in a lot of stuff, right? It's used in a lot of products that go into the body. So it's not necessarily an immediate toxicity concern, but there are some concerns, right? Work from some groups in Germany that do work on tattoos around polyethylene glycol in terms of repeated exposure, because it can break down into some things that may have toxicity to organs, specifically the kidneys. And so, that kind of comes back to the question of, like, if you're going to think about the safety of tattoos, you have to know what you're looking for, right? We also found propylene glycol in a lot of, I think, 15 tattooings. That's not necessarily toxic, right? Its toxicity is about the same as glycerin, which is commonly used in tattoo inks, and I don't think is a component that anybody has real concerns with. The thing that's interesting about propylene glycol, though, is that it is a very potent allergen in some folks, right? In fact, it was the 2018 allergen of the year. I didn't know that they did allergens of the year, but
allergen of the year.
Yeah, right. And so, if you are somebody with a propylene glycol allergy, that ink is a huge problem for you. We also found evidence of what we call higher alkanes, so things like dodecane, so just long chains of carbon and hydrogen that I don't think anybody knew was in tattoo inks. None of the previous work hinted at that. It's sometimes used as an emollient in cosmetics, but it's also most closely related to diesel, I hate to say, right? So do with that information what you will. It's not necessarily toxic, but it's something that's funny to find in there. In some inks, we found alcohols that weren't listed on there that may or may not have some concerns with them. We found evidence in a few inks for an antibiotic that's used to treat urinary tract infections.
Jesus Christ.
And then in a few inks, we also found 2-phenoxyethanol, which is a compound where there is some known toxicity concerns. And at some point, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration had put out a warning about this specific compound and nursing infants and some issues with nervous system problems. So, and, again, I have to emphasize that these were all things that we found at high concentration, right? 2,000 ppm. It's possible that there are things at lower concentration that may be cause for concern. There may not be, but everything that we found is pretty high concentration. And so,
I think one of the things that really shocks me about that is that that's not on anyone's radar, because all of the REACH conversation, presumably the MoCA conversation in the US, is about the pigment particles. It's not about the carrier medium so as much. I mean, for years, I think, historically, again, when tattooers were mixing their own pigments, they would use dish soap, mouthwash, even back, 1,000 years ago, people were using gall, ox gall, or peacock gall was used in ancient Chinese tattooing for that kind of lubrication. But and again, I think that point that you made about not knowing what happens, the assumption that the pigment stays and the other stuff is flushed through. Well, if that stuff's not staying in your macrophage and it's not staying in the skin, if that stuff is the stuff that's going into your body, that's probably the stuff that we should be really worrying about, or worrying about more than we already do. And until I read your paper in preparation for this conversation, it came out a couple of weeks ago, I don't think I'd read anything about the problems or the potential risks of carrier medium at all. It just doesn't seem to be on anyone's radar.
I mean, there's a little bit, I don't want to give my colleagues short shrift there. Ines Schreiber in Germany has certainly highlighted a few things before, but it certainly hasn't been a focus of research. And, it comes back to me, right? If you want to understand the risks of tattoos, you need to appropriately understand what are the risk factors, right? And so with the pigments, maybe that's relatively easy to understand. But I think, polyethylene glycol represents an exact case study for a point I've been trying to make in the community for a couple of years, right? There's every reason to think that stays in the skin with the pigment, right? And, there is certainly concerns that with repeated exposure, the breakdown products can have some potential for kidney toxicity. So what that means is, right, if you're somebody that wants to go out and look for health problems related to tattooing, right? Historically, that focus has been almost exclusively on skin cancer. And, the research there is a little bit mixed and it's still ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, I've got a friend who's a cancer biologist, and we keep trying to find a time to get her on. But my read, as a non-expert of that, is that it's a fairly mixed picture in terms of the carcinogenicity of tattooing per se. Like, there doesn't seem to be any obvious, like even in control in localized studies or in mass population study works, doesn't seem to be any massively clear evidence that tattooing causes skin cancer.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's you're absolutely right, but it's just like with anything with tattooing, it's muddled because the question of like cancer and tattoos, when you talk to somebody who has a small heart on their back, it's never exposed to light, versus somebody who is like covered. But even more, right? Like think of, like somebody like Machine Gun Kelly, who is just completely tattooed solid black, right? That's a huge difference. And, beyond that, when you're looking at, whatever, right? When you're looking at, toxicity across a population, you need large numbers. And because the funding hasn't been there, the studies that I'm aware of that have been published have been a little small in scope. But the point is, right, even if you say, okay, we get to a point and say, okay, there's no issues with skin cancer and tattoos, that's great, right? No problem.
There was a weird study that came out that in mice models, tattooing was protective of cancer in a one particular mouse study. That's the kind of thing you get occasionally with statistical analysis of small sample sized studies.
And you could maybe make an argument for why that is, right? If the pigments are absorbing light, they could be like a skin, like a suntan lotion in your skin. But the point that I've been trying to make to people is, we need to understand better about the stuff in tattooings and the breakdown products, because maybe skin cancer isn't the right thing to be looking for. And so I think the example of something like polyethylene glycol highlights, if that's in a lot of ink, okay, so be it, right? Maybe that's fine. But that means that we should be looking for, are people having kidney problems, right? Is there a weird incident? And if you're not thinking about that, it's, people may not really recognize that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
one of the things
failure with that. I'm just saying that's something that highlights that you have to look.
No, I think you're right, and I think one of the things, as I said, as I was trying to chase down my Mandela effect memory, and I was reading a lot of literature on tattoo death, toxicity. There have been people that have died from tattooing, from sepsis, often, going back a long time. But some of the interesting recent literature about adverse effects reporting is from people who have had laser removal and then who've had they're small numbers and they're rare, which is why they're in the case, but they do exist, of people having either localized allergic reactions away from the tattoo site, so illustrative of the laser dispersing the ingredients of that tattoo throughout the body, or people having systemic allergic reactions that have been difficult to diagnose. And there's a good handful of like studies over the past few years of post laser removal toxicity, none of which were fatal despite my memory, but which have been kind of causing people, some physicians some concern. And I think as the incidence of laser removal increases, and as the kind of novel chemistry of tattoo inks has been so strange, I think that's the kind of thing, as you said, we need to know more about what's going into these things so that we can keep track of the patterns if they emerge.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And to be honest with you, compared to the tattoo ink industry, the laser removal industry is like the wild west, right?
Oh,
it's absolute madness to me, right? At least when you look at tattoo inks, right, the selection of pigments that are used have sort of been culled over decades of, kind of oral tradition passed back and forth. Yeah, I had a bunch of clients with these problems. And so, there's been a degree of sort of validation and kind of unintentional testing around it, right? And, becoming a tattoo artist usually, entails a fairly substantial apprenticeship period and, training, at least in principle. The laser removal business, though, just none of that is required. Nobody really understands how these lasers work. Nobody understands what the hell they're doing. Now they're using even higher powered, shorter pulse width lasers, and it's like, the chemistry is so beyond even beginning to be understood. It's shocking to me, right? And the underlying implication here is that somehow it's a great idea to smash up a bunch of pigments where there may be some concerns around these, and then let the body digest it. Right?
John, you're perfectly setting us up for an episode we're doing in a couple of weeks with a laser tattoo removal specialist. So this will be very interesting. But I was just going to say, as I think that's a perfect point to end on. I was wondering, do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us before we end this episode?
Yeah, well, what I would say, right, one thing I really want to make clear, right, and I particularly every time we do something that gets a little bit of media and, the media takes it in some interesting directions, is that, my team and I are absolutely not anti-tattoo, right? That what motivates us to do a lot of this work at the end of the day is the artists and the clients, right? We've had the privilege to get to know a lot of people in the industry, a lot of artists, and I'm constantly impressed at the level of dedication, professionalism, craftsmanship that goes into this, right? And, at a local level, right, artists are dealing with a lot of regulations around, sanitation, going through these long, really challenging apprenticeships to do this, and they want to do the best job they can for their clients. And so what's motivated us a lot is to really empower artists and clients to be able to make informed decisions and have the best possible outcomes with tattoos. Beyond that, right, our study really focuses on labeling. And while there are concerns with some of these things, we know where the major definite concerns with tattooing are unsanitary tattooing, unskilled tattooer, poor aftercare. And so our focus isn't necessarily to say, these things are unsafe, tattoos are bad, get them out. Our focus is on, we think that everybody has a right to know what's in the inks and make an informed decision. And if you're comfortable with what's in the ink and you're comfortable with that risk, whatever that risk may be, great, get a tattoo, right? We have no problem with that. It's just we think there's an ethical and honestly a legal obligation for these things to be disclosed. And that's really where we're after.
Yeah, I mean, you've sort of taken the words out of my mouth, because I was gonna sort of conclude with that thought too, which was that, yeah, you're more likely to have problems from, as you said, bad practice, unsanitary practice, and ultimately, we're all ingesting lots of horrible things all the time, just living. But as you said, the reason to think about this is not really to kind of raise up more, moral or other kinds of panics about tattooing are going to kill you, but it is about, as you said, about transparency and about, as you said, ethical and legal compliance in a way that helps everybody, industry and outside. So yeah, I mean that's a great way to finish, because I was going to say exactly the same thing. I'm not super worried as someone who's heavily tattooed that I'm going to get a horrible, toxic reaction from some tattoo ink, but I do want to know what is in those inks,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
yeah, thank you so much, John.
Yeah, John, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. It's been, as someone who, like I said, did ordinary level chemistry for my Leaving Cert, this has been a fascinating conversation. So I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Really enjoyed it, and always happy to chat.
Yeah. And also, since this is on the Patreon, it will be coming out to the public in a couple of weeks. I also have to thank our lovely patrons who make this show possible. The £10 and above patrons get a special shout out, and they are, and I'll try and do it in one breath as I always try: Roy Hoxema, Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Charlie Lightning, Baba Extra, Shit Jesus, Sebastian Lewis, Reed Forden, Lupe Calderon, Guernica, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, and Dylan. Did it in one breath. As always, usual announcements. If you want any cool t-shirts or posters or a signed copy of Matt's book, it's beneaththeskinshop.com. And it's a thank you and goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thank you so much, John. Have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Take care, guys.